Probably no other figure in Russian history causes such acrimonious discussions and heated debates as that of Stalin. Mass media portrays him as the greatest villain on earth, or a cartoon monster, or a strong ruler, tough but fair father czar. In the flow of political talk shows, a fierce hatred for Stalin meets an exalted idealization of his image. Behind this barrage of legends and facts, copiously peppered with gossip and untruth, many people find it hard to see his true historical role. Despite this apparent difficulty, it is easy. To do it, we don't need to dig through the details of Stalin's biography or analyze his personality in depth. We only need to throw away the lies, dismiss what is secondary, and recognize what is truly important. It will then become clear what Stalin's place in history is and why his deeds and achievements are besmirched somehow or idealized awkwardly. Most importantly, we will answer the question, what does Stalin mean for our country and the world today? In this video, we choose not to discuss Stalin's personal life. We do not talk about his principles or willpower, nor do we not explore his abilities, phenomenal memory, erudition, or enormous propensity for self-education. It's outside of the scope of this video. This film has a different purpose. We want to remember the era in which Stalin lived, the ideas which he served, and the main milestones which he achieved in his political career. And behind all of that, see the real takeaway from his achievements. Joseph Djugashvili was born in the last quarter of the 19th century, when a time of great changes came to the Russian Empire. Serfdom had been abolished quite recently. The old way of life was breaking down. The hard work of factory and plant workers, heavy burden of taxes and duties, disempowerment and destitution of ordinary workers, as well as growing social tensions. Such were the realities of the Tsarist Russia. The situation was escalating quickly. When young Soso, the son of a shoemaker and a worker, began studying at the seminary, underground Marxist organizations were already working actively in Russia. 15-year-old seminarian Djugashvili gets into one of these organizations and becomes interested in revolutionary ideas. Karl Marx discovered and formulated the general laws of the historical development of human society. He was the first to scientifically establish that everything that takes place in a society depends on the mode of production, distribution, and exchange of material goods. It is the economic relationships that determine all aspects of a human life: politics, law, government and its institutions, culture, ideology, religion, arts, worldview, and morals. The emergence of private property led to the stratification of society into large groups of people classes. A certain class structure corresponds to each mode of production. Some classes produce goods and services. Others appropriate most of what's produced. Means of labor evolve, and so do people. And as productive forces of the society continue to develop, contradictions emerge between classes. As time goes by, the contradictions multiply and intensify. As a result, a new mode of production replaces the old one. At the same time, the ruling classes lose their power and leave the historical arena. They give way to new classes. The succession of socio-economic formations is logical. The slavery system exhausted its development potential and got replaced by a more progressive feudal system. Feudalism fell under the blows of capitalism. In the current historical moment, the proletariat, the class of employees, became the revolutionary class. The main driving force of the historical process nowadays is the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The victory of the proletariat in this struggle is inevitable. It is predetermined by the contradictions of capitalism. The path to it lies through the socialist revolution. Only by taking power into their own hands, by destroying private property and the means of production, will workers be able to end exploitation, to first build a socialist society and then a classless communist society. Marx did not just give a scientific explanation of social phenomena. For the first time in history, the oppressed class has received a clear and understandable political recipe to get rid of oppression. 1898, Joseph Djugashvili joins the Tiflis branch of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. He is engaged in propaganda and party journalism, sets up printing houses, organizes demonstrations, strikes and walkouts, forms combat units and party committees, raises money for party needs, obtains weapons, participates in the liquidation of provocateurs, and organizes expropriations. By the time he gets acquainted with Lenin in 1905, he is an experienced and seasoned revolutionary. The clarity and certainty of Stalin's political views can be traced back to his early works and articles. The time has passed when it was boldly proclaimed that Russia is united and indivisible. Now every child knows that the united and indivisible Russia does not exist, that it has long been divided into two opposite classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's no longer a mystery to anyone that the struggle between these two classes has become the axis around which our modern life revolves. The wealthy bourgeoisie is our irreconcilable enemy. Its wealth rests on our poverty, its joy on our grief. The Russian Revolution of 1905 is defeated. In the following years of the reaction, Stalin, together with Lenin, fights against the Menshevik liquidators and recallists, seeking to destroy the working-class party from within. Lenin appreciates Stalin's organizational skills. At Lenin's suggestion in 1912, Stalin was elected in absentia to the Central Committee of the party and put in charge of the Russian Bureau of the Central Committee. He directs the practical party work in Russia, edits the newspapers Zvezda, Star, and Pravda, Truth, and constantly writes articles for them. He gets arrested 8 times and placed in exile 7 times and escapes from there 6 times. April 1917. The monarchy falls. Lenin returns from emigration. Stalin supports Lenin's course of armed rebellion and works on its organization and preparation. The revolution can't satisfy everyone and everything. It always satisfies the working masses with one end, while beating the overt and covert enemies of these masses with the other end. Therefore, one has to choose, either together with the workers and peasants for the revolution, or together with the capitalists and landlords against the revolution. The power of the bourgeoisie is overthrown. Stalin becomes part of the first Soviet government, the Council of People's Commissars. During the Civil War, he leads the Red Army military operations in the most dangerous and difficult areas. 1922. At the suggestion of Lenin, Stalin is elected the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the party. Since then, he is constantly re-elected and remains in office until his death. After Lenin's death, all the initiatives of the first years of the Soviets are continued. The state plan for electrification of Russia is implemented. Industrial production recovers and grows, science gains momentum, and illiteracy is eliminated at an accelerated pace. During his visit to the USSR, the Indian writer Rabindranath Tagore described the atmosphere of the young Soviet state as follows. What is surprising is the amazing energy with which Russia is seeking to spread education throughout the country. And it's not just the number of people, but also the depth, the scope. And among the semi-civilized peoples of Central Asia, they are spreading education with the speed of a flood. There is no limit to their tireless energy directed at exposing those peoples to scientific advances. Theaters see large crowds of people, and the main visitors are peasants and workers. Nowhere they are insulted. In 2 or 3 institutions I have visited so far, I have noticed a spiritual renewal and a triumph of the newly found human dignity. Ordinary people have shaken off the burden of inequality, been able to straighten up and raise their heads. Now they stand in the world of men with their heads held high. Their minds are independent, and their hands are free. Additionally, in the 1920s, the party outlined a commitment to industrialization and complete collectivization. These objectives were interrelated. It was impossible to achieve one without the other. New construction sites, factories, and plants needed millions of workers. Small peasant farms without modern equipment could not feed a huge country with a growing urban population. The country would not have been able to ensure its defense capability without a well-developed industry. The peace concluded after the first imperialist massacre was just a truce. It was only a matter of time before a new war started. The Bolsheviks understood that very well. We are 50 to 100 years behind the developed countries. We must make up this gap in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us. Stalin said that in 1931. Hydroelectric stations, thousands of plants and factories. Tens of thousands of collective and state farms with machine and tractor stations servicing them. 2 5-year plans brought all of it to the USSR. The French journalist and social activist Henri Barbusse wrote, "These are hard facts. The poorest of the European states, ignorant, numbed, beaten, hungry, bleeding, and devastated, became the largest industrialized country in Europe and the second largest in the world, and in many respects the most cultured. Such unprecedented growth was achieved by the country alone. Other countries were its enemies. External enemies were not the only ones creating obstacles during those years. Many traitors, renegades, and saboteurs acted within the country. Collectivization essentially became the capstone of the socialist revolution in the countryside. Kulaks, well-off peasants, are now often portrayed exclusively as able owners who suffered at the hands of the Soviets for no reason. In reality, kulaks actively opposed the work of collective farms in 20s and 30s. They frequently organized terrorist attacks and arsons, killed collective farm activists, policemen, and Red Army soldiers. However, the inertia of the past and the machinations of class enemies were finally overcome. Yes, mistakes were made on the ground. It is hard to implement a project of that scale without a single mistake. However, without the industry and mechanized farming, the USSR had absolutely no future. The USSR became the first country in world history to construct a socialist system. It was achieved not only thanks to the great enthusiasm of the Soviet people, the living standards of workers kept growing steadily. In the Stalinist USSR, the one who worked well for the benefit of the society lived well. The Constitution of 1936 legally finalized the conquests of the October Revolution and the main foundations of socialism. It did not just declare social rights of which the working people could not even dream before. It guaranteed these rights to the citizens of the USSR in practice. Not a landlord, not a manufacturer, not a czar were now the masters of the country. A worker, a collective farmer, a doctor, an engineer, and a teacher. When enemies invaded the Soviet country, they faced an incredible resistance from its new masters. Such courage, heroism, fortitude, sacrifice, and selflessness at the front and in the rear had not been known to human history. The Soviet army won. The Soviet weapons won. The Soviet technology won. The Soviet industry won. The Soviet collective farms won. The Soviet science and education systems won. The spirit of the free Soviet people, the workers and warriors, won. The Communist Party won, and so did the Soviet diplomacy and the Soviet government, and so did the headquarters of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. They all won as the socialist system proved its complete superiority. That war was a class war, a war between socialism and capitalism. The world capitalist powers, England, France, and the United States, were long preparing an invasion of the Soviet Union. American monopolies, industrial tycoons, and bankers generously financed Germany's heavy and military industries, de facto arming the country. England and France provided a cover for Germany's aggressive foreign and domestic policy in Europe. Western imperialists wanted the German fascists to do the work of destroying, looting, and enslaving the USSR for them. Today, the Soviet Union is presented as the instigator of World War II. But what do we do with the real history then? Cannot hide the annexation of Austria, cannot cover up the Munich Agreement and the phony war, when England and France left their vassal Poland to the mercy of fate. Direct support, as well as a poorly concealed policy of indulgence and connivance, pushed the fascist beast eastwards. However, the enemy made a calculation mistake. Not everything went according to plan. The British and American imperialists eventually even had to make an alliance with the country of the Soviets. Socialism turned out to be head and shoulders above capitalism. The result of the war was not only a complete and unconditional victory over Nazi Germany and its satellites, not only the defeat of militaristic Japan, but also the emergence of a bloc of socialist states on the world map. After the war, the Stalinist USSR performs another economic miracle. In 5 years, the national economy destroyed by Hitler's hordes was restored. The country, which lost tens of millions of inhabitants, without the Marshall Plan and foreign loans, rose from the ruins. Yesterday's allies in the anti-Hitler coalition very soon again declare the Soviet Union their main enemy and begin to make new aggressive plans. However, The Soviet science, industry, and intelligence rise to the challenge here too. The USSR becomes a nuclear superpower with a strong ground force, powerful navy, the second and in many respects, the first economy on the planet. All these factors together made the USSR the core of the new civilization. The popularity of communist ideas grows all over the world. Even the capitalists of the main imperialist power on the planet have to fight it. Just 4 years after Stalin's death, the first artificial Earth satellite would be launched, and in 8 years, the first Soviet man would fly into space. Was Stalin's contribution to the achievements of the Soviet state great? Undoubtedly. It is only in the fantasies of anti-Stalinists that a country's success is possible despite its leader. Was everything that the Soviet people have achieved the merit of Stalin alone, the result of his decisions only? Of course not. In a conversation with the German writer Emil Ludwig, Joseph Vissarionovich spoke about how decisions of utmost importance for the state were made. Among the 70 members of the Central Committee of the party were the best industrialists and cooperators, the best suppliers and military men, propagandists and agitators, the best specialists in agriculture and national issues. Everyone has an opportunity to correct someone's sole opinion, proposal. Everyone has an opportunity to contribute their experience. If this were not the case, if decisions were made single-handedly, we would have made grave mistakes in our work. The success of that time was made possible by the thousands of qualified specialists and managers. Those professionals were trained by the Soviet education system, forged in production, labor, and service. The children of workers and peasants received access to free education. Not in word, but in deed, they could now realize their human potential. It is not socio-economic status, national origin, or gender, but rather personal abilities and personal work of every citizen that determine their position in the society. In the socialist society, social relationships have changed. They became truly fraternal and friendly. There were no more noblemen, no more high and mighty contempt and exploitation. Every person knew that they would never be left without work and housing. They knew that if something were to happen to them, they would receive any medical help they could get without having to pay for it. People's attitude towards work has changed. What was created by workers and peasants no longer went to supporting the luxury lifestyles of the wealthy. A palace was no longer built for a rich man, but for school children and pioneers. The society's resources were spent on education, children's leisure and recreation, social needs, health resorts and health centers for workers, and things raising the population's cultural level. People saw and felt it. The social and economic base formed at that time continued to work later at the time when the perestroika activists were actively destroying the country altogether. Even in the late USSR, it was unthinkable to lose housing because of debts, and the idea of paying for medical services was perceived as savagery and barbarism from another capitalist reality. It's hard for me to imagine what personal freedom an unemployed person can have when he or she walks around hungry and cannot find a job. True freedom exists only where exploitation has been destroyed, where there is no oppression of some people by others, where there is no unemployment and poverty, and where one does not tremble with fear of losing his or her job, home, and daily bread tomorrow. No matter how much they lie about the USSR, it had real social freedom. There was creativity, creation, selflessness, friendship of peoples, and true care about the person of labor. No other country in the world in all of history could boast a similarly fast pace of development of the economy and fundamental and applied sciences. Nowhere was there such a large-scale introduction of scientific achievements into manufacturing as in the Soviet Union prior to 1953. Everything that many people nostalgically remember when talking about the USSR was not a godsend or someone's sole achievement. The successes and victories of the Soviet state are practically implemented ideas of scientific socialism. And Stalin was not just a statesman but also a Marxist theorist. Even his early works became a significant contribution to the development of Marxist-Leninist science. Later he discovered and formulated the basic economic law of modern capitalism. A brief course on the history of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, an encyclopedia of basic knowledge of Marxism, Leninism, the history of the USSR, and the Bolshevik Party, was written in 1938 with his contributions. Stalin became the founder of a new science, which in turn became an important section of Marxism, the political economy of socialism. Joseph Vissarionovich placed a lot of weight on theory. We need our professionals to have a solid grasp of Marxist economics. The older generation of Bolsheviks were well versed in theory. We used to study capital, take notes, debate, and test each other. That was our strength. It helped us a lot. The second generation is less prepared. People were occupied by practical work and construction. They learned Marxism from brochures. The third generation was brought up on feuilletons, a part of a newspaper or magazine devoted to fiction, criticism, or light literature, and newspaper articles. They have no deep knowledge. They need to be given food that is digestible. Most of them were educated by studying not Marx and Lenin's works, but their quotations. If things go on like this, people can degenerate. In America, people reason, dollar is the key to everything. Why do we need theory? Why science? That is how they can reason here. Why do we need capital when building socialism? That is the threat of degeneration. That is death. To avoid this, even in little things, we need to raise the level of economic knowledge. The transition from capitalism to communism, wrote Lenin, is an entire historical era. Until it is over, exploiters inevitably have hope for restoration, and this hope turns into attempts at restoration. The overthrown exploiters, who did not expect to be overthrown, did not believe in it, did not allow the thought of it, with tenfold energy, with mad passion, with hatred, increased 100 times, rush into battle for the return of the paradise lost. That is precisely what happened in our country. After Stalin's death, counter-revolutionary forces came to power. It was not possible to quickly destroy socialism. That giant train had gained too much speed. It took decades of persistent revision of Marxism, sabotage and wrecking of the economy, science, and culture to disorient the Soviet people and prepare them for the restoration of capitalism. There are no ifs in history. We will not speculate about whether Stalin could have prepared in advance and prevented the impending disaster. Many now easily judge what happened. Such judges and critics forget that the Soviet state, from the moment of its existence, constantly faced the threat of destruction. The Soviet state was created not in ideal conditions, but in a hostile environment on the territory of a weakened country. The Bolsheviks inherited not only the damage of 2 wars, but also the underdevelopment accumulated since the Tsarist times. Most importantly, socialism was built for the first time in history. Human civilization had had no such previous experience at all. To date, the USSR remains the main achievement of the proletariat in its centuries-old class struggle. That is why, by the way, bourgeois propagandists throw mud at the Soviet Union. Not because of its failures, on the contrary, because it accomplished too much. It was both a huge success and a painful historical lesson for workers around the world. Any social and political gains can be lost easily if class vigilance wanes. No one, not even the most prominent politician and statesman, can lead the working people to well-being alone. This is a cause for the entire working class, a cause for every class-conscious worker. Despite the defeat of the Soviet Union, the victory of capitalism is temporary. The class struggle continues. Socialism is not an invention of philosophers or an abstract book idea. It is an objective of vital necessity for all humanity and its inevitable future. Lenin's words about the October Revolution can be safely attributed to the whole Soviet experience. We started this work. When and what time, what nation's proletariat will see it through? These questions are irrelevant. What is essential is that the ice is broken, the way is paved, and the direction is shown. 100 years is not a long time for history. Capitalism, by the way, did not win immediately either. The post-Soviet bourgeoisie constantly claims that socialism is ineffective. At the same time, everything that still drives, flies, and shoots in modern Russia is primarily the legacy of that backward era. The peaceful atom and the space industry, the remnants of the once great aerospace manufacturing arms industry and a nuclear shield are all from there. What achievements can Russian capitalists boast of? Breakthroughs of effective managers fleeing abroad with everything they stole, or explosive growth of worn-out pipes, or maybe 20 million people in poverty and a record number of dollar billionaires. Successful businessmen whose entire success is based on the appropriation of Soviet enterprises, shattered industries, destroyed farms, degradation of all areas of life, increasingly inaccessible healthcare and paid education, constantly rising prices, tariffs and taxes, an increase in the retirement age, trillions in offshore accounts. By the way, who can even distinguish which part of our country belongs to the native domestic bourgeois and which one belongs to foreign bourgeois? They try to scare us with repressions. At the same time, during Stalin's time in power, despite the immense losses suffered by the country in the Great Patriotic War, the population of the USSR increased significantly. On the other hand, in the era of bourgeois freedom and democracy, the population keeps declining. Only from 1993 to 2006, 11 million more people died than were born in Russia. There are no calls to repent for these victims of capitalist repressions. The anti-state propaganda intellectuals and human rights defenders do not shed tears for those victims at the Wall of Grief monument in Moscow. No memorial dedicated to the victims of privatization and Gaidar's reforms. TV propagandists talk about the power and grandeur of today's Russia day and night, stirring up ultra-patriotic, if not chauvinistic moods among the audience. However, this virtual reality is more and more clearly at odds with the truth of life in a poor, dying out, and degraded country. We are constantly reminded of the powerful defense system of the modern Russian state. How are such miracles possible when science is defeated and mechanical engineering, electronics, and other important industries are shattered? Moreover, whom are we to defend ourselves from if the so-called potential enemies quietly get what they want? Russia has long become a place of profit-making for imperialists from different countries. This capitalist international does not care about the welfare of the local population, nor does it care about the problems of workers in any other country. No wonder the post-Soviet bourgeoisie continuously recites terrible malarkey about Stalinist repressions to the people they robbed. They need to justify the destruction and looting of the country somehow. The legend about millions of innocent victims fits this purpose perfectly, except it is getting harder and harder to deceive people. Many already understand that Khrushchev counter-revolutionaries, Trotskyites, Western and post-Soviet nationalist bourgeoisie initiated the slander of Stalin. Seeing the recent development, people increasingly begin to look back at Soviet history, searching there for answers to today's questions. Capitalists, however, are not letting their guard down. The misinformation and deception machine is doing everything so that no one could calmly and soberly comprehend the historical experience of their country. We are prompted to hate or simply forget the Soviet era and Stalin. Stalin is dead. Dead as a politician, as a state model, and as a slogan. Stalin is the past, not the future, and there is no request for Stalin in the present. No request? Dead as a politician? This is the irrelevant past which should be put away into the closet of the past, says the capitalist propaganda. Then why do they keep stirring up a hatred for Stalin? There is a single main reason. Since the manifesto of the Communist Party was written in 1848, the path to the world's first socialist superpower was paved in just 1 century. Thanks to Marxism, the spontaneous and inconsistent struggle of workers for their rights gained a clear purpose, became organized, and led to the victory of the socialist revolution and the first proletarian state on the planet. The country proved its viability and power in the most difficult war with Nazi Germany, which relied on the human and material resources of capitalist Europe. The Soviet Union became a guideline and a symbol of hope for workers all over the world. The fact that Marxism works was proved in practice. Humankind discovered and developed a vaccine against capitalism through much suffering. For capitalists, it is deadly. These cardinal chapters of history are inextricably linked to the name of Stalin. The greatest successes of the Soviet statehood came at a time when the country was headed by Joseph Vissarionovich. Therefore, all the power of bourgeois propaganda aimed primarily at denigrating Stalin and discrediting his achievements. Abroad, this campaign began in his lifetime. In our country, it broke out during Khrushchev's rule, intensified during Perestroika, and has not eased its pressure at all today. Anti-Stalinist myths often repeat the texts of Nazi leaflets word for word. In their lies, anti-communists do not shy away from any absurdity. Victims of so-called repressions include traitors, state criminals, and common criminal offenders. When it comes to the numbers, they provide fantastic numbers of political prisoners and convicts. We won, but not the way we should have. There were successes, but at what cost? The bourgeois lies about Stalin can be dismantled endlessly, but does it make sense when you understand the reasons why they are replicated on an industrial scale? The ruling class fears a new, organized attempt to build socialism, even decades after the destruction of the USSR, which fell as a result of betrayal and counter-revolution. They fear because it is through practical experience that the proletariat has proved its ability to build a society in which human exploitation is eliminated and where there is no room for masters. For the first time in history, the oppressed class has infringed upon the sacred cow of private property, presented the bill to the oppressors and parasites of all kinds. Isn't it ironic when means of production and assets are expropriated not in favor of another capitalist, but in favor of another class, a class that should toil away without complaining for a collective bourgeois? That is why the howling about the so-called repressions is rising. Whoever heard of workers taking power into their own hands and taking charge of their own lives? Capitalists would be throwing mud at any other leader of the Soviet state with similar results. It is not about an individual. The Russian ruling class itself proves it with its information policy. Simultaneously with this line of vilification of Stalin, the recent years have seen another line of action. His political figure is sterilized, freed from the communist ideology, and then used for the needs of the bourgeois state patriotism. Stalin is portrayed as an effective manager who allegedly followed the czars in building a great empire. The new Russian bourgeoisie is privatizing not only Soviet enterprises, but also the achievements of that era. The history of the Great Patriotic War demonstrates this especially well. They are even implementing a market rebranding by gradually replacing Soviet symbols with new prints. They are actively diluting the meaning and class context of those events. Modern propaganda is trying to convince us that to defend a socialist homeland is the same as to be cannon fodder of capital in massacres arranged by the bourgeois for the sake of their enrichment. The image of Stalin as the leader of some abstract classless fatherland is safe and useful to the bourgeoisie. One can even recall his firm hand to justify the pressure on his political opponents allegedly in the interests of national security. However, the firm hand of the bourgeoisie is Hitler, Mussolini, and Pinochet, who strangled the working movement, whereas Stalin's firm hand protected workers from parasites. The military might of the Soviet Union was created not to dominate the world for the purpose of robbing and exploiting weak countries, but to protect against aggression by a hostile capitalist environment. Stalin described it best himself. The cause to which I dedicate my life is to elevate another class, namely the working class. My objective is not to strengthen some national state, but to strengthen a socialist and therefore international state, because any strengthening of that state contributes to the strengthening of the entire international working class. If every step in my work were not aimed at strengthening and improving the position of the working class, I would consider my life pointless. In terms of bourgeois law, Lenin, Stalin, and other Bolsheviks will always be criminals. Just like Spartacus, who broke the laws of the Roman Empire, was a criminal for slave owners. Stepan Razin was a criminal under feudal law. The ruling class writes the laws, but the truth is that the capitalist system itself is criminal and anti-human. When one class owns practically all means of production, and the other owns nothing but its own workforce, the relationship between them is the relationship between the exploiter and the exploited. Capitalism sentences hundreds of millions of people to pennies in wages, poverty, unemployment, hunger, and death in wars unleashed in the interests of money bags. It also creates conditions in which the oppressed are forced to fight for their rights. One can demonize Lenin and Stalin as much as one wants, but no one has done more for the revolution than kings, landlords, and capitalists. The modern bourgeoisie is doing the same thing, turning the lives of workers all over the world into hell. History is made primarily by classes, not by individuals, even the most outstanding ones. The Stalin we know has not emerged from nothing. He was shaped by a revolutionary movement in the Bolshevik Party, which fought for the interests of the working class and all honest workers. Bourgeois propaganda can continue to portray Stalin as a mythical villain or a lone hero, to incite a hatred for him or a passive faith in a fabulous savior. Despite these decorations, people will still discover the real Stalin. Stalin the revolutionary, Marxism theorist, and leader of the world's first socialist state. A man who from a young age to the last days of his life was faithful to the communist idea. His name still arouses the hatred of capitalists from different countries, because for them there is nothing more terrible and dangerous than the steel will of the proletariat, who is aware of its class interests and armed with the theory of class struggle. Stalin is a harbinger of their future imminent and final defeat. Stalin's USSR is a harbinger of a new world, where the oppression of humanity will be ended forever.
Раньше буржуазия позволяла себе либеральничать, отстаивала буржуазно-демократические свободы и тем создавала себе популярность в народе. Теперь от либерализма не осталось и следа. Нет больше так называемой свободы личности. Права личности признаются теперь только за теми, у которых есть капитал. А все прочие граждане считаются сырым человеческим материалом, пригодным лишь для эксплуатации. Растоптан принцип равенства людей и наций. Он заменен принципом полноправия эксплуататорского меньшинства и бесправием эксплуатируемого большинства граждан. Знамя буржуазно-демократических свобод выброшено за борт. Я думаю, что это знамя придется поднять вам, представителям коммунистических демократических партий, и понести его вперед, если хотите собрать вокруг себя большинство народа. Больше некому его поднять.